Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for joining us and being interested in this subject that we consider of a very high importance. First of all, this is a co-hosted meeting between the Office of the President of the General Assembly. We really thank PGA for embracing this subject as an important one. Unfortunately, he had a last-minute conflict. You know, these days this happens. So we are having his representation in his chef de cabinet, Ambassador Zoque, who, of course, will I'm sure, represent the PGA fully. Let me start by introducing our GWL Voices, our group. We were established in 2019. On 8th March 2019, we issue our first open letter. We are 65 women now from 42 countries, all of us former senior officials of the multilateral system, using the multilateral system in the broadest possible way, so not only the UN, but the IFIs, the regional institutions. And we have essentially two objectives. One is the strengthening of the multilateral system, and the second one is the empower of women within the construction of the multilateral system. So we see very critical the role that the multilateral system plays to move forward and to enact policies at the global level, but also at the national level, that are in align with the interest of the rights and empowerment of women. This organization was founded back in 2019, as I said, by Helen Clark, former administrator of UNDP, Irina Bokova, former Director General of UNESCO, and myself, former Chef de Cabinet of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. The three of us competed to be Secretary General of the United Nations back in 2016, and as I'm sure you're aware, the three of us lost. We were 7 women competing and 6 men. It was the largest crowd to aspire to the Secretary General position. And in the end, although at the 75th anniversary of the General Assembly, when we adopted Agenda 2030, when Pope Francis was here to celebrate the 75th anniversary, everybody was talking about a woman being the next Secretary General. You are aware, we have an excellent Secretary General, a good friend, a good colleague, but short of being a woman, our good friend Antonio Guterres. So after that, a couple of years after that, the three of us came together and we decided that it was time for us to work on something of shared interest and to show that not only women can compete and compete hard, but also can afterwards join forces and work on issues of real interest. So that's what we are, that's what GWL Voices is. I'm the president of the association, and to my left, a well-known person in this building also, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, former president of the General Assembly. She's the executive director of our group. So without any further time dedicated to our own introduction, we will go into the subject matter. And I would like to start by, again, introducing our panelists. I'm going to moderate today, so you will not hear from me much further. First, of course, again, thank you, Ambassador Laszlo Zoque, as Chef de Cabinet of the PGA, taking his position and his voice towards this conversation. The ambassador is a seasoned diplomat with lots of experiences, so he will fully represent President of the General Assembly. Sarah, thank you for coming. You know Sarah very well, I'm sure, Sarah Henricks. She is the Deputy Executive Director at Interim for Policy Program, Civil Society and Intergovernmental Support in UN Women. We were hoping to have the Executive Director, Sima, our good friend Sima, but Sima has traveled, so she's not in town, and we really appreciate Sarah stepping up and taking the responsibility. Maria Fernanda, I have already referred to. Maria Fernanda not only has been the President of the General Assembly, she has been a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador, her country, her government of Ecuador. She has been Defense Minister of Ecuador, and a long and very fruitful career in many fronts, including environment and climate change, which are one of the strongest voices. Hannah, thanks for being here. Hannah Brixey, she is the Global Director for Gender at the World Bank Group, and we really are happy to count with the World Bank Group in this panel. One of the axes of the changes that may come to the forefront should come from the World Bank Group, so we will hear Hannah telling us what they're doing. And finally, last but not least, Bhumika Muchala. She is a political economist and a part of the Third World Network. She is a researcher, an analyst, and an advocate with many years, unbelievable. When I read how many years, I'm not going to mention it, but a long experience on global economic governance. So again, she brings another angle to this conversation. Without any further delay, let me give the floor to the ambassador to introduce the perspective from the President of the General Assembly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the General Assembly sends his regrets for not being able to join us today. He sends the following message. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Global Women Leaders' Voices for organizing today's meeting. Our gathering holds a singular purpose: to unlock greater gender equality in the financial system, including women's participation at all levels of it. Which concrete steps can we take to shift away from structural inequalities in the world of finance? Well, we often hear that a gender lens is needed, but what exactly does that mean? Perhaps it would be helpful to use a practical analogy. If we were planning a housing development project, we might want to consider the following. What are the gender disparities in the area? And how will the project affect them? What will be the gender ratio of the new jobs created? Is the housing development located near a mass transit system? Will there be adequate street lighting? Will women feel safe, particularly at night? Are we actively engaging women experts to bring their angles into the discussions? Are women's experiences duly considered in our decision-making? Well, that is a gender lens. Within the international financial system, this means gender-responsive budgeting, gender financing assessments, and investment frameworks with gender targets. And indeed, in recent years, IFIs have been making strides to better spotlight this long overdue issue. The IMF launched its first ever gender mainstreaming strategy, and the World Bank is to start a series of discussions on the same topic, taking an approach which recognizes that reducing gender disparities is inseparable from economic growth, stability, and resilience. But only a small fraction of development financing is allocated towards advancing gender equality, falling significantly short of what is needed. Women continue to be underrepresented at all levels of the IFI, from depositors to CEOs. And they seem to be also underrepresented in the various bodies working on the reform of the IFI. Adopting a holistic approach of development, one that is gender responsive and gender proactive, can have positive impacts for the entire global community. In September, the General Assembly will convene a series of crucial meetings to give a boost to the cause of sustainable development. They will also have an important role in shaping the discussion on the reform of the international financial architecture, as called for by more and more leaders. I share the view of the Secretary General that today's cascading crises are compounding shocks on many countries, especially developing ones. We have to leave behind the current global financial system, and not only because it is often short-sighted and crisis-prone, but also because it is mostly unfair. Unfair as it exacerbates inequalities between countries and within societies. Indeed, 1/3 of emerging economies and 2/3 of low-income countries are in or are near serious debt distress, with a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable segments of society. But the current system is unfair also because it is keeping open financing gaps which are disadvantageous for women. And it is unfair also because it still fails to ensure an equal role for women in decision-making. We need a financial system that works for all, including women and girls. And we need a financial architecture in which decision makers prioritize investing to support just, inclusive, and equitable transitions for societies around the globe. Now, to achieve that, we must work together to better align the international financial system with the 2030 agenda. I am convinced that addressing gender inequalities is a sine qua non, an essential requirement from a new system of international finances. And it will also help us to actualize the truth that human rights and sustainable development are mutually reinforcing, that they are two sides of the same coin, and that we should use this coin to unlock the transformative potential of humanity. But this will require political will and practical tools and the empowerment of women. And I hope this meeting is a significant step in that direction. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Nzoki. We hear through you the voice of PGA, and we really appreciate his message. When we met a few months ago and discussed with the PGA the opportunity of fostering this partnership to have this meeting, he was very forceful on the idea that the notion of reform in the international financial architecture had to do with SDG investment, but also with women. And that's why we came out with this proposal, which in the end is back-to-back with the Paris deliberations that just took place. So maybe I'll go now to Sarah and ask Sarah the view from UN Women.
Thank you very much, not only for convening this important space and dialogue but also for ensuring that it's focused on a topic of such important relevance right now to the world and to the women of the world. Ambassador and Ms. Mallorca, Ms. Fernanda Espinosa, Ms. Brixie, I'm being very formal, Hanna, and also Bhumika, distinguished colleagues, I am sharing with you a statement on behalf of our Executive Director from UN Women, who likewise sends her humble regrets as she is traveling and was not able to be here today. But wanted to thank all for this invitation for UN Women to share this important space, to reflect on the role and the place of women in shaping a new financial architecture. And we will have soon a very important roundtable discussion reflecting on women as users, women as providers, women as regulators of financial services, women's roles in negotiations to transform our existing financial structures. But before we dive into those details, allow me first to provide some framing remarks and offer some reflections on the context against which this discussion takes place today. Certainly, while the global economy was in many ways failing women and girls long before COVID-19, the pandemic very much brought those pre-existing structural inequalities into sharp relief, into sharp focus, as we witnessed the intersections of COVID with increased rates of violence against women, with the increased unpaid care burdens on women and girls, and with the failures in social protection systems to support women's economic and productive well-being. In this past year, the data, both from IFIs and the UN system, is showing that there has been a deepening of these inequalities. In some cases, a deepening more so than in the past decades, as the economy has further destabilized with the deterioration of global peace and security, with rising food insecurity, with what we call the cost of living crises around the world. We also know that humanitarian needs continue to grow in scale and complexity, and this coupled with forced displacements of women due to complexity of protracted conflicts, as well as political insecurity and climate change, are all coming together in these polycrises to disproportionately impact the lives of women and girls and their economic well-being. Against this backdrop, what we see is that the world is off track to achieve gender equality. This is probably not news to you. However, the data is showing a very sobering picture where only 25% of the SDG gender targets are actually very far from being achieved. And at the current rate, it will take more than 300 years to achieve full gender equality. It's our collective work in this context of regression, where we also see the entrance not just of polycrises, but also of the pushback on gender equality, the complexity in terms of drastic reversals of women's rights and restrictions, be it in terms of mobility or public participation, or even economic engagement that have been witnessed around the world. And so if we are to push forward against this pushback, we really cannot accept less than the full and equal participation of women in all spaces. And of course, this can and must include the reform of the international financial institutions. It must include that space as well. We know that there has been progress on women's financial inclusion, but the status quo in terms of financial institutions, in terms of the representation of women, is quite grim. In 2023, so this year, there are 22 women at the helm of central banks around the world. This is good news. In fact, it could be considered very good news until you add how many central banks there are. There are 186 of them. So it's 22 of 186. If we look at the European Central Bank, we know it is headed by an excellent woman, but all 20 members those central banks are run by men. The absence of women in leadership roles and in decision-making bodies within international financial institutions, it tends to perpetuate a one-dimensional perspective that fails to account for the needs and aspirations, of course, of half the world's population. And so we believe that including not just women's voices, but their talent, their expertise as financial regulators, as those who can contribute meaningfully into especially the digital financial economy, into the negotiating circles to bring fresh perspectives, to bring innovative solutions, to bring collaborative approaches. These are essential for addressing the multifaceted challenges, the context that I began with of our time. Certainly, by shutting women out of these critical spaces, we perpetuate the notion that women's participation and perspectives are less valuable or perhaps irrelevant. And it's high time to challenge and to change that notion. We need a financial architecture that both works for and represents all, including women and girls. I very much look forward to diving into this conversation with all of you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for delivering that message on behalf of Executive Director Sima Banhus, and thanks for being with us to start this conversation. You said it right. We are going to have an interactive conversation. This is not going to be just speeches. We want to have a discussion that includes all of you. And maybe I'll start just by framing the conversation with a question that will be introductory to all the panelists, and that is, what do you think are the advantages of including gender equality and women's rights perspective in current negotiations? There are negotiations going on and initiatives to transform the existing international financial architecture, including financing for development, and I will argue probably starting with financing for development. Maria Fernanda?
Thank you, dear Susana, esteemed fellow panelists, all protocol observed. Thank you to the PGA and the PGA office for your interest in teaming up with us to organize this event, to SEMA and UN Women, of course, for this interest in this very critical subject. I think, responding to your question, Susana, I think that there is wide acknowledgement that the international financial architecture that we have today, and that was designed more than 70 years ago, needs to be repurposed and to respond to the challenges of our times. And I won't repeat what we already heard, the multiple and compounded crises from climate to debt, from transactional inequalities to conflict, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at what is happening today, more than 60 countries are in debt distress as we speak. And of course, that has incredible impacts on women and women well-being and rights. Global public debt has increased 5 times in the last 23 years, of course, outpacing our capacity to produce, outpacing global GDP. And the debt service has become perhaps one of the major obstacles for low and middle-income countries to meet the SDGs, including SDG number 5. So the question is how developing economies can find the financial and fiscal stability while making the investments needed to transition to more equitable, sustainable, and low-carbon economies. One of the answers, of course, is that we need profound changes in the frameworks, in the structures, in the decision-making mechanisms of multilateral financial institutions, the power share within these institutions. What gathers us today here is precisely the need to look at the reform of the international financial architecture from a gender and women's rights perspective. And why is it so critical, you ask, Susanna, to bring women and gender equality to this discussion? And the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, we have a top representative here among us, Hannah. You know, the multilateral banks have a significant impact on global economic governance, on financial stability, on sustainable development. We see that it is imperative that we recognize the critical role of women and prioritize gender equality within these institutions' reform agenda. So this should not be an afterthought, but be a built-in mechanism. And first and foremost, what we all know and we keep repeating, but we should remind ourselves that we are talking about 50% of the world's population here. And basically, and these 50% are key drivers of sustainable development, of economic growth, in by excluding or marginalizing women from decision-making processes and policies of financial institutions, we miss out on their unique perspectives, their expertise, their potential. And by including gender equality, we, on the contrary, tap, as Sarah was saying, into a vast pool of talent, of innovation, of knowledge that can fuel sustainable and inclusive development. So gender equality is a matter of rights, of fundamental rights. It does make sense. Women should have equal access to financial resources, it was already said, to economic opportunities, but also to decision-making power within the system. And by incorporating a gender lens into the reform of financial institutions, we can really help in what I would call dismantling, let me just, this is recording everything we say here. That was not my intention. Sorry about that. But I was going to say we are able to dismantle systemic barriers and discriminatory practices that hinder women's full participation in the global economy. So inclusive economic policies, it was said, that put women at the center have a ripple effect on societies and communities. And there are many studies and evidence proving that. So basically, it has been shown that when women have control over resources and decision-making, this leads to better outcomes, not only for their families and households, but for countries and regions and for the multilateral system as a whole. So basically, I think that achieving gender equality in the context of rethinking the international financial architecture, I think requires more than mere rhetoric, because we've been hearing this, but we truly need concrete action. And the action basically is about gender-responsive policies, programs, initiatives. You spoke about gender budgets. This includes mainstreaming gender markers throughout the institution's operations, strengthening data collections, analysis on gender-related issues, et cetera, et cetera. In the reform, I strongly believe, should prioritize the representation of women in leadership positions. As you mentioned, the number of central bank heads and the teams that they have around them, which are basically all men. I think that women's voices must be meaningful, but not only at the top, but the structures, the mechanisms, the institutional settings should be, gender sensitive and equal. I think that basically, in more concrete terms, I would like to just close by giving three concrete examples. One is equal representation of women in all hierarchies of financial institutions, from management to the boardroom, ensuring diverse experiences and perspectives, considering the decision-making processes when we are retooling the systems. Number two, the development of financial products with a deep understanding of women's unique needs and challenges, from microfinance, from saving schemes, etc., climate resilience and adaptation, where women play a critical role. Number three, a collection and use of gender disaggregated data. That's one of the weak points most of the time. This data can be used to influence policy and product design, monitor progress, refine gender inclusion strategies, etc., etc. So, and let me again here closing to say that the conversation we're having today is extremely important. I'm just coming back from the Paris summit for the new financing pact. And that was a very powerful summit, many outcomes, significant strides towards fostering a more responsive and equitable and inclusive international financial system, lots of outcomes, commitments, the interconnectedness between poverty reduction, carbon neutrality, and biodiversity protection, excellent language. We like the Bridgetown Initiative, the Debt Relief and Green Recovery Initiative, the promise of reallocating 100 billion of special drawing rights towards poverty reduction and climate adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. And after all of this, if you look at the outcomes and the documents that resulted out of the Paris summit, there is no mention to women and gender there. This, makes the point is that, the evidence tells us that there are strong reasons to call for a gender equality and a women's rights perspective in the redesign of financial institutions, but it's still not part of the conversation, of the narrative, of the negotiations that are taking place, as Susanna mentioned before. And just to close, I think that we cannot simply afford to overlook the role of women and gender in the reform of the international financial architecture. And I think that by embracing women's rights and gender equality, we have to understand that, they're agents of change. They are builders of sustainable and more equitable societies. And they have, I think Sarah mentioned, they are thinkers, providers. They can transform organizations and systems. And they are extremely important economic agents for economic stability for the future. So that would be all from my side. Susanna, sorry that I think I took one additional minute, but over to you.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. And I take one word, well, two words, in fact, that you use. Women are and continue to be an afterthought. And this is at the heart of everything we discuss, And again, Maria Fernanda referred to the recent deliberations in Paris, a very welcome initiative. But again, women are not there. So it's an afterthought. And Hannah, I would really like to hear your perspective coming from the World Bank Group. How do you see the whole question of the reform and the intersection of women with that, given your specific responsibilities?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm truly thrilled to be part of this distinguished panel and this uniquely important conversation. So Susanna, I'll make 3 points in response to your question. So first, let me start with the evidence, because the evidence is very clear that when women participate in decision-making, decisions are better. And the outcomes, including development outcomes, are better. And they are better not only for women, they are better not only for children, they are better for everyone. So let me give you a few examples. In the private sector, let's take companies. When companies increase the share of women in corporate leadership from 0 to 30%, profitability goes up by 15% on average. And that's evidence. We also see that when companies increase the participation of women in corporate leadership, innovations go up, numbers of patents go up, reduction in intensive energy use is stronger, reduction of CO2 emissions is stronger, the climate governance is better, and also the adherence to the environmental, social, and governance standards is better. So this is all evidence from the private sector. Let's now take communities and utilities, like water utilities. There is also evidence, and it shows that when women participate in decision-making, that the services, the hours when services are provided are longer, that outages are fewer, that water management is better, that water systems work better, that environmental management is better, and that natural resource management is better. And you find these studies. This is all what I'm sharing with you is based on evidence, because the World Bank Group, as we know, is working with evidence. Sometimes we are doing advocacy, but this is not advocacy. This is evidence. Let's take disaster risk management. A recent study that we have done looking at how disaster risk management plans have been developed and how effective they have been and what the outcomes then have been in implementation. And we see that in countries and communities where women participated in the development and implementation of these disaster risk management plans, that the results were better because these plans and their implementation better reflected the diverse needs in the society, in the communities. Now let's take the financial sector, and what we see in financial institutions is that having women in decision-making within financial institutions also makes a huge difference, that there is actually less bias, fewer stereotypes, and more inclusive provision of services. And also wider selection of wider products and services to accommodate broader needs. So this is just few highlights from the evidence. There are important areas where we would like to and would welcome partnerships to invest in further evidence. Because, for example, we see that when women participate actively and in decision-making in communities, that also social cohesion is stronger. And the risks of fragility are lower. When women participate in peace accords, the durability of these accords is longer. But these are areas where perhaps more evidence is needed, and it would be wonderful to partner. Now, I move to the second point, and that's more now looking at the World Bank Group. We now recognize very clearly, based on evidence, based on experience, that it is urgent, it is fundamental, and also it is uniquely challenging to make progress toward gender equality. It is urgent for all the reasons that my fellow panelists already highlighted. It is fundamental, well, because it's human right, but it's also essential for development, to make progress to any other development objectives, whether it's poverty reduction, productivity and growth, climate action, and so on. And it is uniquely complex because what we see is that, yes, financing is important. Yes, policy reforms are critical. Yes, programs need to be designed better to serve women and empower women. But it's also about mindsets, and it's also about norms. So building a wider consensus toward gender equality, framing the solutions so that more members of societies agree that it is good for society, that it is good for countries, good for communities, good for households to have more gender equality. That's really an area where further action is needed. So, as the World Bank Group, we've just completed the implementation of our past gender strategy and now are developing the new World Bank Group gender strategy. In fact, we are launching formal consultations tomorrow. And for those of you interested, I can share with you these cards with a QR code where you can find the strategy draft, and not only that, you find a lot of the evidence of not only how much difference it makes to have women in decision-making and elsewhere, but also what works to get to better results in advancing gender equality. Our key objective in the strategy is to accelerate progress to gender equality for a more peaceful, prosperous, and livable world. We set forward 3 strategic objectives. One is to end gender-based violence and elevate human capital. So it is about the foundational well-being. Second, it is to expand and enable economic opportunities. So it is about jobs, equal access to jobs, including the jobs of the future. And it's also about ownership and control of economic assets, from land to mobile phones. And it's also about enabling services, childcare, and care economy, investing in the care economy more broadly. Mobility, safe transport for everyone, digital services, and so on. And the third strategic objective, and that's new for the World Bank, new emphasis, to engage women as leaders. And something the World Bank Group can do in every sector, because we work in countries in every sector, and it is, in some sectors it should be easier, right? Let's take education. The majority of teachers tend to be women. Unfortunately, not the majority of school principals are women. Right? And we already have, and in fact, as I said, you will find some examples how cost-effective, sometimes very inexpensive interventions can actually prepare and position and encourage women to enter into the competition for a leadership position and succeed. Now, how to get there? So we highlight, based on all the research and experience, we highlight 3 key drivers of change, how to get to better outcomes. One is innovating. So using evidence to improve policies, improve fiscal policies, improve sector policies, to develop programs that work, but also integrate the behavioral approaches in these, so that they are framed in a way that it would resonate and in communities. It would resonate with the influencers. So think about behavioral approaches to really help shift mindsets and norms along with the policies and programs. Second, it's about financing. Yes, it is the international financing institutions, but importantly, and that's also where the World Bank Group can and will, and it's committed to do more, is to help governments, help companies in better integrating gender analysis in their fiscal policies, in their macroeconomic and sector policies, to invest in gender data so that they can make better informed decisions. So it's also the financing that the governments and the private sector are allocating. And then collective action, acting collectively. And again, that's a new emphasis for the World Bank Group, to act collectively. Of course, there are many great partnerships, but we feel that we need to further expand partnerships, further expand the engagement with the wide range of actors, including civil society organizations, actors who actually are in a better position than the World Bank to influence mindsets and to engage. And we have some great examples, for example, facilitating the collaboration of social workers with local religious leaders to align messaging against gender-based violence, against female genital mutilation, against child marriage, for girls' education, and so on. So we really see, and I'm delighted actually we have this opportunity. As I said, we are starting the consultations tomorrow, and I really look forward we will have opportunities to hear ideas, feedback, suggestions, how better we can further partner and act collectively toward gender equality. My third and final point, very briefly, just on walking the talk. I think it was Sarah and Maria Fernanda mentioning also how important it is within the international financial institutions. So just to give you a few examples from the World Bank Group. So corporate procurement policies. Actually, the World Bank Group is the first and the only multilateral development bank sourcing with targets for sourcing from women-owned businesses. So recently we received the Platinum Top Global Champion from WeConnect. But still, actually, in spite of the effort, it's just a small share, so it's still a long way to go, but important on the procurement front. Second, in countries where we operate, we in fact are implementing, and we're first multilateral development bank implementing disqualifications of contractors who don't adhere to efforts to address gender-based violence. And three, which is critical on the HR front, we have targets for gender balance in senior management as well as across all grades, and invest in the hiring, recruitment, retention, talent development, and promotion through a gender lens. And again, still a lot of work to be done, but this is clearly a target that we are, gender equality internally that we are working to. So thank you again. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Hannah. Once again, you brought us to the reality that, yes, there is a lot of evidence that proves that what we are saying here should be obvious. But it's also true that it is not. And not only it is not obvious, there is pushback on these questions, and that's our challenge these days. Bhumika, you bring the perspective from the developing world. Tell us how you see this.
Got it. So thank you to the organizers of this very critical event. I want to thank Susanna, Maria Fernanda, and the ambassador, Sarah, and also Hannah, of course. So thank you for the invitation. It's much appreciated. So I was really pleased to see this title. In fact, what we need to explore in this current context of multiple crises is a truly gender equitable, not merely sensitive, international financial architecture. So just to situate the context very briefly, the global economy has always been marked by deep asymmetries of power that are historically constructed, where the global north and the institutions whose decision-making they control through voting power and political influence and agenda setting have been disproportionately responsible for producing these asymmetries. However, the last 5 years, as has been noted by my fellow panelists, have been particularly exceptional. The world has faced a global pandemic and a multitude of crises, from economic, climate, political, social unrest, and through them, a reversal of years of progress on poverty, gender inequalities that are structural and multidimensional, a setback of SDG achievement. In fact, many say that, the debt crisis is literally killing the SDGs, combined with a supercharging of inequality as we see the private sector, corporations, and financial markets soar, while historic inflation is creating cost of living crises across the global south. So in this sense, the international financial architecture as we know it, as we understand it, is no longer confined to the macroeconomic, financial, and institutional. It is inherently about gender inequality, which is intersectional with race, class, caste, citizenship, for example, and it is intersectional with climate justice, where gender, climate, and the sovereign debt crises across the South are playing out today in very critical ways. They cannot be separated. And at the center of this is the resurgence of austerity measures that systematically constrain public services and goods, critical for both gender equality and climate adaptation in the current context. So we've heard from our fellow panelists as well, the Global South is in the deepest crisis in 50 years. More than 54 developing countries are currently in a debt crisis. Several have defaulted and will continue to default. Repayment of debt has increased to approximately 25% of total government spending across all developing countries, 5 times that of national climate spending, 9.5 times that of health, 13.5 times that of social protection spending. So what these numbers make clear is that debt servicing, which goes disproportionately into the hands of the richest private creditors and institutional lenders in the financial markets of the North, who for the most part, refuse to participate in fair burden sharing in debt restructurings, drains resources away from the very commitments of the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement: health, education, social protection, climate adaptation, a genuinely just transition. Women are at the center of this drain of financial resources from the services and goods they need the most to not just survive, but also thrive. Meanwhile, many countries are being forced to exploit their natural resources, including fossil fuels, to generate revenue for exactly these debt repayments. So as debt-distressed nations sign on to financial assistance loans from the Bretton Woods institutions, fiscal consolidation, or in other words, austerity measures, are enacted. Today, there is a resurgence of austerity-based loan programs, with the International Monetary Fund having advised 159 developing countries as of 2022 to retrench public expenditure through either financial loans or macroeconomic surveillance reports. Public expenditure contraction means reductions in public employees and wages. It means regressive taxation. It means labor flexibilization and privatization of state-owned firms. This creates the triple jeopardy on women's human rights, increases women's poverty, and its structural gender inequalities. This is what we know as gendered austerity. The first of the triple jeopardy is diminished access to essential services, second, loss of livelihoods and increasing precarity and exploitative labor, and third, increased unpaid work and time poverty, which is known as the care economy that subsidizes the wage and production economies. These budget cuts reduce or eliminate the very public goods and services women rely on. Particularly in climate crises, public services is at the front line of adaptation strategies. Women turn into shock absorbers of austerity measures. What do we mean by shock absorbers? We mean that women compensate for the services and goods the state is not delivering through their social provisioning. We saw this clearly in the pandemic. Women stepped in and provided the health and education that the state was not able to, because 40 years of austerity has eroded public systems and the resilience of public services and goods. A feminist economics perspective argues that public financing is retrenched with the implicit assumption or expectation that women will compensate for the lack of services the state is not carrying out through their physical, emotional, and mental labor. The care economy of social provisioning is valued by economists at almost 11 trillion, representing a vast subsidy to the world economy. And yet it is absent from conventional measures of economic production such as the GDP, and is taken further advantage of by the austerity consensus. Regressive taxation at the center of gendered austerity is central to gender equality. It is economically vulnerable women who are disproportionately affected by value-added and general sales taxes, oftentimes on staple food commodities such as rice or lentils. We are seeing this play out in the IMF loan to Sri Lanka today, where women are at the forefront of paying the debt of the nation to the private creditors. So designing, adopting, and implementing a gender-just and redistributive taxation system is a human rights obligation under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, a key treaty in the UN system. So this also means progressive taxations are needed on wealth and income, particularly income from capital, profits, financial assets, inheritance, property, and land. So a gender equitable financial architecture is about taxation, about austerity, and about the debt crises. So how I want to just then briefly summarize what are the course corrections, and I'm sure we can expand on this later too. What are the course corrections? So the course corrections, because we are here in the UN right now, the Financing for Development Forum, from 2002, the Monterey International Conference on FFD has been the key forum through which means of implementation through systemic change to the financial architecture have been addressed. What we need for a gender equitable international financial architecture is to come back to enacting these key reforms and institutional governance changes in tax, debt, and global economic coordination within the Financing for Development Forum. A rights-based economy that implements redistributive and reparative policy change for global economic governance and multilateralism that serves people and planet, not accumulation and extraction, is inherently going to address debt and tax at the forefront of equitable fiscal governance. So this means briefly a global tax convention in the United Nations through the Financing for Development process, which can deliver not just an equitable tax system for the South, but a feminist tax system, which finances women's human rights and substantive gender equality, because all countries have a seat at the table and an equal say in determining international tax rules. It also means revamping the international debt architecture, which through the Group of 20 and the Common Framework has simply not delivered debt relief. And this is not just civil society or myself saying it. Economists out there are saying this across the Financial Times and news reports. So a priority must be made toward a debt workout system within a multilateral framework for fair burden sharing between creditors and debtors that can address unsustainable and illegitimate debt, including debt cancellation, in a process that convenes all bilateral, multilateral, and private creditors. Responsible lending and borrowing guidelines formulated by very UN agencies in the United Nations system needs to be put into practice. And the debt sustainability assessments are a peculiar calculation and methodology that has not so far included the financing that would be required to meet climate commitments, nor gender equality or SDG financing. So I conclude with also just really highlighting that when we talk about a just and rights approach to the international financial architecture, that we need to address that SDG financing as well as climate financing cannot rely only on private finance mobilization or the blended finance instruments, that there is now growing international consensus from the Paris Summit to the Bridgetown Initiative to the World Bank's Evolution Roadmap, which specifically highlight mobilizing and leveraging private capital, requiring the state to create an enabling environment for private investment. Specifically in the World Bank's own document, they talk about how the state needs to absorb private sector risks through means such as co-financing, loan guarantees, political risk insurance, or public equity co-investments. This is essentially socializing risks and privatizing profits in what has been called by many academic scholars as a de-risking state. And the alarm of the de-risking state is precisely that it reduces the scope for a developmental state. So in the global zeal to tap into private financing to plug fiscal gaps that are created by these very debt and tax drains, we need to ask who benefits, who is exploited, and what is being neglected or erased. The ongoing drains of financial resources, historically, commodity dependence, unequal terms of trade, and constraints to structural transformation. One of the elephants in the room in the financial architecture is precisely the constraints to economic diversification and equitable green transition within trade and investment treaties that are legally binding. So for private investments, to channel funding in equitable ways, it is possible. Private financing is not inherently negative. It is how it is done through the kind of regulation that we need.
We need to wrap up.
So I just want to wrap up with just saying that the systemic course corrections require multilateral economic governance, especially through the Financing for Development process, which the UN has a really unique space to contribute to and enact in the world system. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bhumika. You started by suggesting a twist in the title, and we take full note of that. Instead of gender sensitive, gender equitable, and you then went on to have a bath of reality on the full situation and proposing options. I think we have here everybody. Maybe would you want to chip in after having here the different views? Sarah, will you, or we just open up to the floor? Okay, so any reactions from the floor? I mean, please go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Majda Muchu from Morocco. Thank you very much and good afternoon indeed. And this is actually a very important discussion on financing and the importance of women in, including women in financial institutions. I was following carefully and with great attention all what has been said. And I'm sharing basically the 99% of what being said, just keeping always the 1% for doubt, but and hope, actually. I just wanted to take the floor to say that today morning, we had a staff meeting at our mission. And, our mission is 10 diplomats women and 5 diplomats men. So my ambassador told us that he was in a meeting yesterday evening, and he shared with us a statistic which I took note of, and that was shocking for me a little bit. Even though I've been here for 8 years in the UN here, but I didn't pay attention to these statistics. He said that, since 1946, only 4 women chaired the UN General Assembly, while 74 men occupied that same position, and that for 77 years, which is almost 8 decades, only 4 women could lead this multilateral, which is symbolic of inclusivity and everything, multilateral organization. So saying that, now I'm linking it to the financial institutions. Just a simple question. Are we going to wait again for, how many years was it? 77 years, 8 decades to have the legitimate inclusion of women in leaders' decisions in financial institutions. So that was clearly, quickly, what I wanted to say. Of course, I totally agree with all the evidence presented by the World Bank, and that's the World Bank, and I'm happy that they're giving evidence, which is obvious, as Mrs. Susanna said. I'm so happy that I also served during the chairmanship of the General Assembly of Mrs. Espinosa. And UN Women, also one statistic that now I took note of, which is also not good. The one in 2023, only 22 women are at the head of the central banks out of 186 central banks. That's also shocking statistics. But anyway, there is hope in us, in the future youth delegates here, but also in the positive masculinity. I'm sure that my dear friend Fernando is one of the leaders in including gender perspectives in all the UN, at least here at the level of the UN, gender perspective in our policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm glad the ambassador has raised this question. Let me pass a little bit of an ad here. One of the works that we have done as GWL Voices is a report that we are now working on, a second version, that it shows the representation of women in leadership throughout the system at large. It's not only the UN. And the first statistic that is shocking is that since 1945, when the UN was established as a reference, only 12% of the time of 33 institutions that we look into were women. 13 of them never had a woman at the top. That has improved to 12 because the meteorological organization now has an Argentinian appointed to lead, I think, as of January 1st. But 13, this was March this year, 13 had never had a woman. 5 only had a woman once. And then the number of women PGAs, 4 out of 77, 78 now will be. And the 4 of them, I should say, come from the Global South, which is also very telling. You know, when we think that this is not something that the Global South embraces normally. So, and the last thing we have come forward with, and we share with you, is that it is about time to have gender alternation at the presidency of the General Assembly. So what we are proposing is that there is, as it was established at the time, a geographic alternation, which is good and fair, to include gender alternation. So 1 year is a man, the next year is a woman. So some get upset with me when I say this because they say, well, that doesn't make up for the history. I say, well, let's at least move forward to a gender parity in the future. So thank you for raising that. Please, the next, there you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody. I'm Ambassador Noemi Espinosa. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of Honduras. No, thank you. I agree also with a lot of what I heard, and I'm also very happy to report that I come from a country where we have beyond gender parity because we have a female president, President Xiomara Castro. We have a female Minister of Finance, and we have a female president of the central bank. So I think we're doing very well with the new government. And the new government has as a tagline, the refoundation, the founding again of Honduras. And we often say that the refoundation of Honduras has a female face. And I'm one example of that, for example. So, thank you. Thank you. So, you know, what that leads me to think about is that, for example, Honduras we're doing our part. So we're asking others to do their part because we have women in power, and we have a feminist national plan, and we have a feminist foreign policy. So then I just want to address 3 of the issues that were brought up, or one, and then bring up 2 more. Definitely the reform of the financial institutions is the cornerstone to the future of a gendered financial institution or gender equality. And we believe that reform also means more equitable global economic system, like the colleague from the last colleague that spoke so eloquently about that that asymmetry in the global economic system. The reform of the financial institutions should be based on addressing that asymmetry. And the second point is, you know, Honduras is a middle-income country, but we have 74% of our population that lives in poverty. So, you know, we are a middle-income country, but because it's only measured by GDP, so our status as a middle-income country hinders our ability to obtain debt relief, to have certain capacity buildings, to have technology transfers and other financial instruments or financial benefits. So we are strong advocates of a movement of beyond GDP and a multidimensional look at these financial measures. And that's something that we negotiate here at the UN with our colleagues from Morocco, actually, in the lead. But I just want to make that point. And the third and the most important point, I think, is, like I said, Honduras, we're doing our part, but where's the money? You know, we need the funds that were promised in ODA, the financing for development for sure, but we haven't even met the Addis Ababa commitments. So when we talk about these things, we need to make sure that the money is there for them. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I recognize, I will come to you in a second. I'll recognize the next request for the floor, I think is from Argentina.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Luciano Escobar. I come from the Argentine delegation to the UN. My delegation wants to express gratitude for this very inspiring event. Not only necessary, but I believe that all of us are going to leave the room now much more motivated and focused on what we need to do for gender since being gender sensitive regarding the international financial institution, but not only that, your reflection at the beginning, Madam Malcorra, regarding this organization even, we have been discussing this in revitalization of the General Assembly a few weeks ago. We never had a Secretary General, a woman Secretary General, and as you just stated, only 4 women were PGAs in this organization. So I was reflecting a lot while you were addressing your presentations, and it is very clear, but we need to keep stating this, how dispar and different is the impact in financial policies in different countries. And when we talk about debt, that is even worse. Women they're not paid the same as men in general. They don't get similar protection because sometimes they are not registered or self-employed, and this affects the whole lifespan until they are older women. And then we need to think as well as we were thinking this morning at the event in the care policies since the very beginning, since girls until they are older women. And so thinking of the policies of the international financial institution, I'm happy to hear Hannah mentioning that there are some standards in order to provide financing, etc. And that is very important because I was thinking of the OECD guidelines for multinational companies or the guiding principles in the UN, trying to have something similar in the private sector, but even in the financial architecture, it is important to have something like that. And I say all of this because soon we are going to start discussing substantively the Summit of the Future. And one of the topics in the Summit of the Future is going to be the reform of the international financial architecture. So my question to you, as you just mentioned, Madam Marcorra, a very great idea like this gender alternation for the PGA, what would be your suggestion for us delegates that is going to negotiate the Summit of the Future when we address the financial architecture? What would be your suggestion for being gender sensitive? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I recognize that, but I'll go back here and then floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm with the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. I just want to say that it has been made very evident by the feminist movement in their macro analysis many decades ago that gender equality is not a micro issue, it's a macro issue. And many feminists around the world have proven that the dire situation in which women are in are a direct outcome of institutions that are seated at the same table, for instance, the World Bank and the IMF. If women are in such a dire distress is because of the measures imposed by the World Bank and the IMF in women around the world in developing countries and many other countries that have been imposed austerity measures and fiscal adjustments. So it is really just appalling to hear the World Bank saying that they care about women's empowerment or violence against women when it is their policies, their macro policies, the origin of the situation in which women are in. So it is not about a mental system. It is not that we have macho men in the developing countries, and so therefore we need to fight the mentality of people in the global south. It is these austerity measures that are pushing women into shock absorbers mode forever. And the multiple inequalities in which women are living in is making it so hard for national governments to promote gender policies that are accountable for the multiple realities and challenges that our women are facing. So it is really appalling to hear the blindness of the institutions that are sitting here keep on talking about how they care about women, while in reality, they have no disposition to abide by the human rights framework or to review the very same policies that are causing the damage in the first place. And the same here for UN Women. Keep on insisting about women's participation rather than really as transforming the system, talking about women's human rights. Women participation, come on, it's so 80s. Sorry, Madonna called. She wants her title of Queen of the 80s back. The solution is not about women's inclusion. We need system transformation. And this is, of course, also the lack of engagement with the feminist movement. This is not about women. It's about a radical system that is analytical and the very same ED of UN Women has not sat down with the feminist movement ever since she arrived.
I very much appreciate you got your point across. I think
there are many points.
Well, but we don't have much time left, and we need to give a space for everybody. At least I fully understood your message.
There was an hour and a half talking about women's inclusion. I'm making a different point, and I'm being shut off. So by all means, keep on talking about women's inclusion.
I'm sorry. I didn't shut you off. I'm just trying to ask for a fair share of time for everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I gave you the floor. There is somebody who raised the hand on that side of it. Thank you.
The Women's Environment and Development Organization. I want to support what my colleagues Bhumika and Amelia have raised. With kind of a specific question, especially as we see kind of the IFIs taking on more of a gender and climate portfolio, sort of what that means in terms of distraction from UN processes. We heard about the Paris Summit and about the Bridgetown Initiative, and there's a lot of concern within civil society about the kind of distraction from the UN principles and processes that we've all been following for a long time. So just want to hear, as we talk about the Summit for the Future and FFD in 2025, how we can ensure that these aren't conferences that take up less and less of the space in the international discourse, and that they actually do lead to a recentering of multilateralism and of the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Rodolfo Reta. I'm representing Mexico here at the UN. I wish that my colleagues from Second Committee would have attended this meeting, because there's a lot of power to the truth that was spoken today, both by panelists and by the audience. I've been negotiating FFD for 3 years, and when we talk about the promise to fulfill the 2030 agenda and leave no one behind, we do believe that in financing for development, women and vulnerable groups have been left behind the most. The discussion that we're having here in the UN to reform the IFIs, to reform the MDBs, is seen in a macro space where vulnerable groups and women are not necessarily considered as part of the package, but it's to safeguard the socioeconomic empowerment of the country as a whole, to get them to invest in the SDGs. But when the promise and allocation of resources is made, there's no specific direction of whether or not this is going to be given to support gender equality or women's empowerment in the country. Yes, Mexico has a feminist foreign policy, and we just recently announced our new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alicia Bárcena, former head of ECLAC, who's an icon in this field and also an icon in FFD, because during the pandemic, she was one of the few voices who was calling for a universal income to support vulnerable groups and women's inclusion. So when we're talking about representation and we're talking about empowerment of women, for us it is very important also to support access to quality education for financial literacy and financial inclusion. If we don't support this, then it is impossible for women to actually have an opportunity to become the leaders that we expect them to be, because I'm sure that everybody here in this room understands that having a balance of gender and having women in positions of power and decision-making impacts substantially the growth and development of countries. So as long as we don't link this part of education, financial inclusion, and education, as well as digital literacy, to the gender dimension in the upcoming reform, then we will not make enough progress, because we will not give them the tools, resources, or spaces to improve their capacity and to actually get to these positions. The fourth conference on FFD was mentioned, of Monterrey 2002, Mexico, a very big supporter. We do believe that this is the time to start the conversation, and once we have the adoption here by the UN on when and how to have the conference, Mexico is going to promote to have this to be an inclusive multi-stakeholder process from here to 2025, and to have gender as one of the pillars, because we do need their voices to be heard, and we do need them to help us shape what the future is going to be, because they're going to be a part of it, and we cannot leave them behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very proud to have Alicia Bárcena as the foreign minister, and she has been a member of our group, and now she, of course, is taking other responsibilities. The floor.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and really thank you for this initiative, which I really enjoy listening all the proposals here. I think that we are discussing one thing related to the participation and visibility of women, especially in the financing work, let's say, which is something that, we spent many years really discussing the importance of women, the importance of the gender perspective in the decision-making processes and so on. But my question is that now that in a very short time, the UN is going to start with this negotiation on the new financing for development, maybe one specific suggestion is just try to see when a resolution or a decision is approved in the budget of the UN, normally it has a kind of a report or study about the impact in core or non-core in the organization. Maybe the other possibility, as in many other countries and parliaments, is just to introduce a specific gender impact in each of the resolutions and in each of the decisions here in the UN. I know that this is not just to fix the world, but at least it's a specific suggestion that maybe can help for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure member states around the table are listening, and it's a good approach. Listen, we are getting to the end. We have only a few minutes left, and we will be kicked out of the place. So before that happens, I will really like to have the opportunity of a devolution by colleagues who, particularly ones who were mentioned, to see whether they would want to say something. Maybe Hannah, I will put you on the spot first, and then we'll go to UN Women. Hannah?
It has been a fascinating discussion, and I very much appreciate the perspectives, especially from CSOs and from feminist organizations. The challenge sometimes with feminist organizations is that they don't listen. So I just would like to share some facts, and because we are, personally, in fact, I meet with feminist organizations on a regular basis. Last time we had a good discussion yesterday. The draft strategy, when you will see, is informed by including research of feminist organizations. Because in my view, feminist organizations bring a very important perspective, and especially organizations that work on the ground in helping and solving and addressing specific challenges that women are facing in communities or in sectors. Now, let me share some facts. When you look at the World Bank's operations last fiscal year, which was just completed, 95% include analysis of the gender barriers in the given sector. They bring in evidence, including global evidence, in what works to address these barriers. They develop results framework, how to address these barriers, what kind of interventions in the projects actually help address these barriers. And there is a results framework with indicators, and the results are being measured. So when you look at any operation, and these are public documents, you actually can see it. And I would actually welcome, substantive discussion. So when we look at, let's say, budget support operations, more than 80% of these policy packages include policy actions that address gender gaps or advance specific gender equality. It may be issues such as policy reforms to improve prevention and response on gender-based violence. It may be increased financing for childcare. So again, you can look at these, what you called austerity packages. It's called now budget support or development policy operations. And you will see that 80% have specific policy actions toward gender equality. And again, it would be good then to bring in evidence, what has worked well and what could be done better. So I would welcome more exchanges based on evidence. Now,
Hannah, we are running out of time.
My last point, I very much like the point actually made that it is not just about inclusion, about women's inclusion. I think this is critical. And for example, what has been accomplished in recent years through social safety net program, digital money, going to women, providing women with then bank accounts or mobile accounts, it's a huge step toward empowerment. initiatives such as We Power, bringing women into employment and leadership in energy companies for the job of the future. Similarly, in Equal Aqua, in water sector.
And
so lots
I
of
have
examples.
to shut you off.
So lots
I'm
of
sorry.
examples. I just wanted to share some evidence in response to some of the suggestions. Thank you again.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you so much, and really appreciating the perspectives that were shared. I think the challenging question of, are we going to focus on inclusion and parity and not look at a transformative perspective of the realities of the dominant economic system, is the questions we should be asking. And in fact, I was very regretful because I did have just that prepared to talk about before we went to the floor. And so I'd love to share that prepared note now at this point, which did start off by saying that at the same time,
very briefly,
that at the same time that we know that diverse perspectives in decision-making in banks can lead to better regulatory and policy making in financial systems, we also know that that's not enough. We should strive not just for a gender-sensitive global financial architecture, but a gender-transformative one. And being gender-transformative must go beyond recognizing gender disparities or parity or inclusion, but seek to actively address and transform the underlying structures and power dynamics that perpetuate gender inequalities. We need, and I wanted to make 4 points, and maybe it's a good way of closing off today's conversation. First, we need to transform macroeconomic policies. So as part of the points that have come up throughout the discussion, including debt relief, progressive taxes, and especially for low-income countries, cooperation through ODA to ensure that resources flow to where they are needed most and where they can make the biggest difference. This is what the UN Secretary General calls for in a new social contract in our common agenda. Second, we need to ensure coherence between social and green policies and financing, another point that's come up quite a lot, including from yourself, Bhumika, very eloquently. Transitioning away from fossil fuel economies will result in the loss of jobs, but creates millions more. And ensuring women and young people get their fair share of these opportunities is critical. Any climate financing package should be gender responsive and transformative, including supporting countries to align their fiscal systems with climate change mitigation, adaptation,
Sarah,
as well as social justice.
If I may,
And my third point was just around countries having the fiscal space to prioritize care as a critical priority. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We go full circle there. I very much appreciated. Maria Fernanda?
Wow, that's a challenge. Very quickly. Basically, I hear, it's not about women's participation. I heard loud and clear the ambassador of Honduras saying we have done our part, and then now we want the ODA, we want the FFD, we want climate finance, we want the 100 billion in SDRs for LMCs, and that is very clear. But how we do that if we don't have the proper structures and power dynamics within the organizations that have to do the work? And that's basically what, from our perspective, should be a gender transformative international financial architecture. That is the critical issue. It is about the power dynamics, how we take decisions, how the frameworks are established, why we're saying, because there's evidence that the common framework of the G20 is not working. That's one comment. And the second comment was, G7, G20, the Paris summit are distractions for the overall universal G193 processes. And I think I'm here, I'm one of the 4 women presidents of the General Assembly. I strongly believe that everything has to happen among the G193, of course. But I think that the G7, the G20 process, the Barbados and France initiative, are spaces with heads of state deciding on things that then we need to translate and use the things that are useful into the G193 space. And I think that perhaps they're not distractions, but there are opportunities to pass the agenda alone. In Paris, I have to be honest and frank, this orange color was not there. I didn't see that kind of narrative. I didn't see that kind of struggle. And believe me, I was there and present, struggling for what? For a debt relief, green and inclusive recovery for developing countries.
I'm going to cut off Maria Fernanda to be absolutely equitable. Bhumika, do you want to say something here? Very, very brief.
This has been a very generative discussion, and the importance of the UN as a space where the Global South has a voice is very critical. In the Bretton Woods institutions, the governance structures have not changed since 1944. It's at the risk of becoming quite outdated and unfit for purpose. So how do we center this universal equitable forum for decision making? And that includes not just voices, not just inclusion, but also a real shift in the power imbalance. We don't talk about power enough, and we need to strategize better on redressing the unequal power relations that characterize our world economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhumika. You, of course, bring a very, very substantive perspective. I will not even try to wrap up here, but I want to say 2 or 3 things that I believe come out of this. It's true, participation is not enough, but it's also absolutely required. So let's not contradict ourselves, putting things that are either or. We need participation. If we don't have participation, we don't have power share. If we don't have power share, we will not be able to introduce the structural changes. So it's not that we say participation for the sake of participation. There is a plan behind that. So that's one thing. The second thing is, clearly the structural reforms that are required, and some of them have been put on the table here, require this institution to be fully working at full steam. And to do that, we cannot see the discussions getting into a place where everything is adversarial and we are unable to come to conclusions. That's part of the responsibility, and I couldn't agree more with you, Bhumika. For the G77, let's put a name here, there is no other institution as important, as fundamental, as significant as this one. We need to sit at the table, stay at the table, and find solutions. That is significant. And so I think that what we are saying today is let's be transformative. To be transformative, we need women to be part, so we need participation, but we also need the conviction that only around the table you can make the changes. You cannot do it outside the table. And I'm going to finish with something that we always say as GWL voices, which is deeds, not words. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.